Welcome. It's good to have you back. And we'll start, of course, with our bracha, Baruch, Atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And, uh,
Amen.
and of course, we are now in the series on Genesis, the once a week that we do. And I'm going to share the screen. And this, if we get to it, and I think we will, has one of my favorite Torah Tamimas, which I hope to share with you. So we are in that conversation of the snake with Eve, right? So let's put that, and let's go here. So we had just started chapter 3, and I pointed out this play on words that you had in this last verse, Vayu Shnehem Arumim. The two of them, that is Adam and Eve, were bare. This is the meaning of arum. And then it says v'hanachash haya arum, right? There's that same word. And there are two distinct meanings that possibly might be related to each other. And that means subtle or cunning, something like that. And there's something about when you are tricked by someone that you feel in a way stripped. And so there may be some connection here with that. Well, it's a lot to think about. At any rate, he was more subtle, cunning, mikol chayat hasadeh, of all the beasts of the field, asher asa Hashem Elokim, which the Lord God had made. And I think that is interesting, right? That it's making the point that here you have this particular animal, but it's not trying to pull away the fact that God made that animal, right? We don't believe in one power, or rather in two powers, should I say, excuse me. We believe in one power that is the source of both these things. So God also created the snake, the serpent. Vayomer el ha'isha, and this snake said to the woman, Af ki amar Elohim lo tuchli mikol etza hagan. So Rashi explains a little bit of the Hebrew here is a little bit rough, I would say, right? But what it's saying is, it's like a statement of saying, did God really say that you shouldn't eat from all the trees in the garden? Okay. And we'll take a look here at the Rashi. We stopped in the middle of it. Arum Mikol, right? More subtle, more cunning than all. Lefi Sher Ormato Ugdulato Haita Mapalato. Arum Mikol. Okay. So it says in in proportion to his cunning, right? His by the way, it can also mean wise, but it also has this evil connotation, which means cunning, right? Also, all involves intelligence, right? And its position of greatness, because it was from all the other animals, right? Haitam mapalato, his fall was arum mikol, was greater than all of them. In other words, more denuded, right? More stripped, arur mikol, cursed from all. So it was in proportion to his use of his intelligence in a negative kind of way. And maybe there's a subtle hint to humanity in that. And here's this uh, difficult language here, which Rashi puts in simple terms. Shema. Is it possible? Or perhaps that's what the word Shema means. Amar lachem, he said to you, Lo tuchlu mikol, you shall not eat from all, maybe from any, etc. V'af al pi shera'a otam ochlim. Rashi goes on to say, despite the fact that the serpent saw them eating misha'ar perot, okay, he saw that they were eating from the other trees. Right. So I think it's as if he said to her, did God tell you couldn't eat from any of the trees? And of course they could, right? Hirba alehadvarim. He said too many words to her, right? He said a lot of things. Kedei shetiyash venu, in order that she respond to him. V'yavol ladaber ba'oto ha'etz, and she would in fact come to speak about that particular tree, meaning, of course, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So Rashi has actually exposed for us the nature of the snake's cunning, right? He purposely distorted what he knew to be the truth to get her to respond and wind up talking about the one tree that they were forbidden to eat from. And now we get to the response. But Tomer Ha'isha ela Nachash, and the woman said to the Nachash, to the serpent, Mi pri eitz hagan nochal. We are indeed able to eat. We can eat from the fruit of the tree of the trees of the garden. Umi pri ha'etz asher betoch hagan. But from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, Amar Elohim, God said, Lo tochlu mimenu, you should not eat of it, velo tig'u bo, nor should you touch it, pen tumutun, lest you die. And of course, you might notice that that isn't, in fact, what happened, right? God never told them not to touch it. He only told them not to eat of it. And that raises a whole big deal, okay? And it's really wonderful. It raises a lot of issues. So let's take, first of all, at the Rashi here. Velo tigubo, nor should you touch it. Hosifa al hatzivui. She added to the command, the fichach ba'al lidei geraon, and for that reason she wound up with a reduction. In other words, not even doing what she had commanded to do. She wound up with less than she had started. Ushenemar, and that's referred to in Mishlei Lamed, chapter 30 of the book of Proverbs. Al tosef al dvarav. Do not add to his words. Don't make out that someone asked for more than they actually did or said more than they did. When you quote somebody, quote them accurately, as accurately as possible. And now we're going to get to that Torah Tamima. And it's fairly lengthy, but I think it's worth it. Okay. Okay, so it's this one right here. Let me make sure I've got the right one. Yes. Okay, here it goes. Verse 3. Right? Lo velo tigubo, nor should you touch it. Amar Chizkiah, and now this is quoting a sage by the name of Chizkiah. Minayin shekol hamosif koreya. How do we know that anyone who adds actually subtracts? Shene'emar, as it says, Amar Elohim lo tuchlu mimenu velo tigu bo. God said, you shall not eat of it, nor shall you touch it. And this is from the tractate Sanhedrin on the Talmud. Let's take a look here. So this is Bet, and that starts here. HaKadosh Baruch Hu lo hizhira al hanegi'ah. The Holy One, blessed be He, never warned her regarding touching. V'hi ba'atzma hosifa, but she added it, right? Those are her words. Those are the words of Eve. She herself added it. Umitoch kein nistavev geraon. And through that, this reduction took place, this lessening took place. Shedachaf hanachaf et chava al ha'ilan, because the snake pushed Eve against the tree, ad shenag abor, until she touched it. So now she was touching it. Amarla, and he said to her, the snake said to her, Re'i, look, she'en mita al hanigi'ah, you didn't die. There was no death associated with touching it. V'kach lo tamuti af al hachila. So look, you didn't die, you didn't become mortal touching it, you're not going to become mortal if you eat it. You see that. And he says, and look further, lefanenu, before us, the Parshat Truma, in the Perek, or rather in the Parsha Truma, that's towards the end of the book of Exodus, the Pasuk Amatayim V'Chetzi Orko, where it says regarding, I believe, the ark, it says it's 2.5 cubits is its length, drasha me'inyan zeh, a similar kind of interpretation. But we go on. Here we are. We're going to get into it right now. Ukvar higishu harbe mefarshin, and there were a lot of interpreters of the Torah who sensed b'koshi anyan, that there was a problem with this explanation. She'im ha'isha hosifa mida'ata hatzivui denegiah, that if the woman in fact added herself on her own, right, this command regarding touching the tree, hare yada ha'emet, she in fact did know the truth. She actually knew the truth. Sha'akadosh Baruch Hu lo tziva ala negiah, that the Holy One, blessed be He, never did in fact command regarding touching it. And if that's the case, echnit patata the divrei nachash. Well, how was it possible that she was seduced by the words of the serpent? She'amar kashem she'ein mita al hanegiah, who said, well, just as there was no death involved and associated with touching it, kach ein mita af alekala. Likewise, there's no mortality involved if you eat it. I mean, she knew. Aval be'emet anyan mevu'ar me'od be'avot derabi Natan. He says, but in fact, this whole situation is explained very, very well in another book, a midrashim, called Avot derabi Natan. This is extant. The fathers of Rabbi Nathan. It's also Perek Aleph in the very first chapter. Shebe'et shemasar Adam Harishon l'Chava, because that at the time when then Adam transmitted to Eve Tzivav Shel Hakadosh Baruch Hu, God's command, al meniat achila, regarding the prevention of eating for the tree, asa siag lidvarav, he made a fence to his words, va'amar lo isur gam al hanegiah, and he said to her the prohibition regarding touching it. In other words, why did Eve say this? Because Adam had told her that. Kedei shetahei suga b'shimur ma'achila, so that she would be fenced. In other words, there'd be another layer of protection regarding her eating it. In other words, if she couldn't touch it, then for sure she wouldn't be able to eat it. We actually had something like this regarding what we were doing in the regular Torah portion, reading Emor in Parsha Emor, where it talked about priests who were unclean not touching sanctified food. And we understood that. We were told that it didn't really mean touching, it meant eating. And now we're looking at sort of a reverse situation where there was a prevention by telling her she couldn't even touch it. And because of this, Masha Amar Kol Hamosif Korea, that according to this, it says anyone who adds, in fact, takes away. Lo Kae al Chava, it's not addressed to Eve, Ella al Adam. It's addressed to Adam. That Adam was the one who added to the command and wound up then in trouble because of that, because it wasn't the truth. V'taham hasiyag negi'ah she'osif Adam harishon midato, and the reason, right, this reasoning of this fence of touching it, which Adam added on his own recognizance, right, that he did on his own. L'cha'ora eino mevu'ar. It's not so clear. Mehechi teta Allah al da'ato. Where on earth did it occur to him? Right? Why did he occur to him, lo sif siag kazeh, to add this kind of fence, quote, to the Torah? V'halo stam ma'achalot asurot ein asurot b'negiah, because we know that when it comes to foods that are prohibited for Israelites, for Jews to eat, there is no prohibition about touching these foods. V'yesh lomar, and maybe one could say, al pi hasvara, regarding the rationale, shekatvu haposkim betam hadavar, that the decisors of Jewish law, right, people who made decisions regarding Jewish law, but tam hadavar, regarding the reason for this, shemutar liga be'ocholin beyom hakippurim, that one is permitted to touch food on Yom Hakippurim, on Yom Kippur, v'lo chayshinan, right, on the Day of Atonement, when you're forbidden to eat any food, but you're allowed to touch it. V'lo chayshinan, and we are not worried, shema yavo lechol, that he's going to wind up eating that food. V'asur liga chametz. However, when it comes to chametz, when it comes to leavened food, one is not allowed to touch leavened food b'Pesach, on Pesach, shema yavo la'ochlo, lest one comes to eat it. And so why is it that you're allowed to touch food that you're not allowed to eat on Yom Kippur, but you're not allowed to touch food that you're not allowed to eat on Pesach? Why? And the reason for this is Yom HaKippurim b'delay mikol machalim. And the reason is that on Yom Kippur, you have to stay away, you have to keep away from any kind of food at all. You're not allowed to eat at all, lo chayshinan, and for that reason, we're not worried, shema yavo lechol, that he's going to wind up eating it, because he's not allowed to eat any food whatsoever, which does not apply to chametz bepesach, shezulat chametz, because with the exception of chametz, ochlim hakol, you're allowed to eat anything. And since you're allowed to eat anything as long as it doesn't have chametz on Pesach, that's why we're worried that maybe you'll wind up eating chametz. Whereas on Yom Kippur, you're not allowed to eat at all. And that's the distinction. And that's for that reason we're worried that you might come to eat chametz as well. Yes, David, did you have a question?
Actually, okay. So one thing. So first of all, this last part, then, that's what I thought is degree of temptation, right?
Correct.
On Yom Kippur, no temptation, because okay. My other question though is, okay, I understand that I understand the supposition that Adam told this to Eve, but where's the actual proof? I mean, most of the time, at least, we get something that there's some obscure passage somewhere that backs this up. So where's the passage that actually backs that up, other than blaming Adam?
Okay. The reason is this, that it doesn't make sense if we're saying that Eve herself made this up when the snake, and we say that the snake pushed her against the tree and was able to get her to eat from the tree of knowledge itself, because when he pushed her, of course, nothing happened. Baruch Halevi Epstein the Torah Tamima has said to us, there's no reason then the snake could say to her, well, you see, it didn't die when you touched the tree, you're not going to die when you eat the tree, if Eve already knew that, because she'd made it up, that they weren't going to die if they ate the tree. How was he able to succeed in seducing her? And
okay, so that's I get it now. Okay, so if she had made it up, then she would know she'd made it up, and when she got pushed against the tree, then she would have still been more resistant around eating it, because she would have made it up. Because okay, so in other words, the only explanation then that makes sense is that Adam had to have told her that, and therefore she basically, that's how she got tricked.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. And not only that, it's explicitly mentioned in this early midrash of Avot Rabbi Natan. It actually says it, that Adam told her.
Okay.
It's not scriptural,
but
it's interpreted.
Right. Yeah, it's that's what I mean. Okay. All right. Fair enough. Thank you.
All right. Onwards. All right. Here we go. All right. So, V'lachen asru gam b'niyah. And for this reason, they also said you're not even allowed to touch chametz on Pesach. And he gives you the halachic references. He says, check out in the Shulchan Aruch or Echaim, it's the name of one of the major books of the Shulchan Aruch, and he gives you exactly the passage, etc., etc. And this is Magen Avraham. It's one of the commentators on the Shulchan Aruch. It's there. He says, lots you can see there. Ulefize, and according to this, mekevan she'etz hadat amad betoch she'ar ha'ilanot, and because this tree of knowledge of good and evil was standing in the midst of other trees, shemekulan hutar lechol, that you're allowed to eat from them, kamoshe katavnu, as it states explicitly, it says when God gave the command, Mikol eitz hagan achol tochel, you are certainly allowed to eat. You should certainly eat from all the trees that are in the fruit trees that are in the garden, with the exception, of course, of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Hare dome inyan chashach bazeh, so is kamo chametz b'chesach. This looks exactly like the situation we've got where you're not allowed to eat chametz and Pesach. L'chein hayad dan le'esor gam b'nigiyah. And for that reason, it made perfect sense for him to prevent her, to tell her it's forbidden to touch it either, the dok. And this seems pretty good, pretty proof. He ain't finished. And this is really lovely. This is the reason I'm sharing this with you, because we're getting now drilling down into the very issue of what the rabbis did. I mean, so much of the rabbis' work, that's the early rabbis, our sages, was building a fence around the Torah. And in fact, in Pirkei Avot, it says, build a fence around the Torah. Here we have Adam building a fence around the Torah and there being a problem. Lefi zeh kasher, but according to this, we've got a problem. Mishum kol hamosif gorea, right? As it says, anyone who adds detracts. And look, we've just shown that it made perfect sense, right? That the rationale behind this particular law so looks, in other words, that is saying you're not even allowed to touch the tree of knowledge of good and evil, matches exactly the situation of chametz and leaven on Pesach. Al hahosafa min hadin, and regarding an addition which is logical, right, that makes sense. Ein shayach lomar shehu geraon v'chaser, right? It doesn't apply to say that this is in fact detracting and in fact taking away. V'tzarich lomar, and one has to say, mishum deyesh lechalek ze me'erech chametz b'Pesach. So we are going to have to say that there was something about this situation that is different from the situation of chametz b'Pesach. And I'm going to keep going because this, I think, demonstrates Baruch Halevi Epstein's brilliance. Ya'an, and the reason is ki hachametz haya lo sha'at hakosher leheter, and that is because there is a time when you're allowed to eat chametz. They were never allowed to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but if it's not Pesach, you're allowed to eat chametz. So there is an additional layer here as to why you have to be careful. Ragil Adambo, and for this reason, it's common. A person is used to eating chametz, whereas with Adam and Eve, they never, ever were supposed to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Masha ein ken befri ha'etz, which is not the case when it came from the tree of knowledge. Shene'esar bo Adam, from which man was forbidden. Lo haya lo me'olam sha'at heter. There was never a time when he was allowed, permitted to eat it. V'hevei kenevela devadil meinei, and it is like nevela. Nevela means meat that is not slaughtered in a kosher way. It is like devadil meinei, which one is supposed to stay away from. Lachein ein chashash benegiah. And for this reason, there is no concern that one regarding even touching it. Because since you're not allowed under any circumstances to eat nevela, we don't have to worry about touching it. And for this reason, there is no reason to forbid a person from touching nevela. And for this reason, telling people that they could never touch even nevela, it would actually detract, just like it did in that case of the Garden of Eden. Ukesvarazo, and according to this rationale, Katav Hashach, the Siftei Kohen, it's another one of the commentators on the Shulchan Aruch, wrote Yoreh Deah. It's another one of the books we mentioned, Orech Chaim. Yoreh Deah has to do with elements of Jewish ritual law for the most part, but other laws as well that are not for, these are basically laws regarding that require expertise. And he gives you the reference, right? The afalpi she'asur la'halot al hashulchan. Here we go, another very interesting example, that even though you're forbidden to place on your table she'ochel alav basar, on which you are eating meat, ma'achalei chalav, you're not allowed to put dairy foods on a table where you're eating meat. Aval basar nevela mutar. But when it comes to treif meat, if there's treif meat on the table, then you can put dairy food on it. Mishum de nevela bedil adam midei. Because when it comes to this kind of food, a person is not ever allowed to eat it. And that is it. And I think this is fascinating, just really interesting, and how we got this from this situation here and discussing other situations in halacha that in some ways resemble it. So we will continue now next time with the regular, let's find it out. Yes, we're into this here. Make sure I've got the place here in the right place. So, okay, we will continue here next time. And I'm going to stop the share in a second. Any comments? Yes, David, is that your hand raised? Is this
actually it is. So
okay, cool.
it almost okay. This whole thing is based on the idea that it's okay to like load up on temptation if you're not supposed to do it in the first place. I mean, the whole point about treif meat, and then you can put the dairy on the table because you weren't supposed to eat the treif meat in the first place. That's
Right.
okay. Versus,
Right.
we normally can't, we can't mix milk with meat because if it's kosher, then of course it's not allowed to do any of that.
Correct.
But it seems like but pardon me?
Go ahead. I said you're correct.
Yeah, but so it seems like we're almost saying you're adding more temptation, right? Because you already didn't, you're already putting out the treif meat, which is a temptation, and now you're adding the milk on top of it, right? Which is an additional temptation, and we're saying that's okay because we're supposed to be able to avoid all temptation, right? I mean, that's adding more temptation on it should be okay because we already know in the first place not to do it. And I'm like, yeah, that kind of logically makes sense, but human nature usually winds up caving when it comes to, you keep on adding things to it, the mix, and then you wind up with, bad things happen. I guess my point, what I'm thinking here is like, you put out a treif hamburger and then you make it a cheeseburger. You're just piling on. So anyway, that's what's running through my mind, and
Right.
and it just seems to me to be leading to actually commit it, do something bad as opposed to avoid it. It's just, yeah. Anyway, that was my input. I don't know, yeah,
No,
that's my input.
okay. So what is interesting here is that uh, the Torah Tamima is reflecting a cultural issue, and that is that the idea of Jews eating non-kosher meat is just so abhorrent they wouldn't even think of it. Okay. So, in other words, the situation is sort of interesting and it's hypothetical, which is, and the question that you're raising, which is how did that treif meat get onto the table to begin with, right?
Yep.
And hard to think of a practical issue. So, unless maybe you're eating with a non-Jewish person and you're putting treif meat on the table for the non-Jewish person to have, okay, and you're sitting there and eating alongside, and because there is a sense of this particular idea of Jews not eating treif meat that is so strong that there's no chance, and that it's sort of a crazy thing. It comes out like one of those great, what is called, I think, a klutz kasha, which is what's the blessing you say over a cheeseburger, over a treif cheeseburger. And the answer is that the issue of the separation of milk and meat doesn't apply to treif meat to begin with. The separation of milk and meat only makes sense when you can eat the meat and you can eat the milk, and the fact that you can't eat them together. But if you're forbidden to eat the meat to begin with, the addition of milk doesn't add anything to it already, because you've already thrown yourself out of the game by eating the treif meat to begin with. So what's the
Yeah.
bracha? There's no bracha. There's no bracha.
Right.
It's a cute question. It's a cute question. There's no blessing you can make over it. So I think the point that you're making though is because we're so used to so many Jewish people not observing kashrut and eating meat that is treif. Although it is interesting, uh, I think uh, I think when it comes to bacon and pork, more Jews are observant of that they will not eat bacon or pork. They will eat treif meat, but they won't eat, in other words, meat not properly slaughtered, but they will not eat bacon or pork. Of course, there are those who do, but there are many, I think many more who don't, but will eat non-kosher meat, regular meat. And we'll stop the recording with this. And I just thought it just raises some very interesting points, and I hope you enjoyed watching this.